Hey, this is Khan, you're watching Ninja Pulls, and welcome to this comprehensive guide to Templar damage in the Elder Scrolls Online. Templar inspires real devotion among its fans, which fits, I suppose, with the whole holy warrior theme. Maybe it's the light show, the aggressive animations, maybe the beam, but there's something players can get almost addicted to and which keeps them coming back to this class. Templar has excellent single target damage, largely thanks to its crazy execute. Splash damage is good too, if not top tier, and there's a rhythm to the combat loop which makes it very engaging and easy to maintain. Templar also fits into the lore and setting in an interesting way. Watch this video for more on that and the different user experience of each class. For builds and rotations, always check ninjapulls.com, but this video is about the nuts and bolts of this class, how it all fits together, and how to get the most out of it in PvE. Start with the passives. Piercing Spear. Free critical damage if we slot an Adric Spear ability. This is a very valuable damage stat, and this passive makes it easier for us to reach the 125% cap. So we always want one of these on the front bar and ideally both bars. PvE enemies do not block, so the second part is only relevant for PvP. Spear Wall. Near permanent minor protection if we're using puncturing strikes, our class spammable. That's actually great since minor protection isn't a super common buff in PvE groups. Burning Light. This is a big one. It constantly triggers so long as we stay on the offensive. It can hit for 20k and typically pops every 2.5 seconds or so, adding about 6k DPS on average. One potential downside is that it can hit enemies that you don't intend. Small ads who get up in your face, for example. Balanced Warrior. Just free stats, the extra armor is good to have, but because the weapon and spell damage is a percentage increase, that amounts to a lot when we're in a trial and have loads of other damage multipliers active. Enduring Raise. One of those slightly boring ones which adds 2 extra seconds to certain abilities, raising their damage per cast, but throwing them out of sync with all of the other dots in the game. Prism. Every class except Sorcerer has an ultigen passive like this, and the Templar version is one of the best ones. The 6-second cooldown lines up perfectly with Backlash, which also lasts 6 seconds, and is the core ability around which we're usually going to base our entire rotation, at least for bosses. That means the maximum amount of ultigen per minute if we do our rotation properly. Illuminate. This is our unique group damage buff. Minor sorcery, 10% extra spell damage. Again, the better your group and the more buffs you have on you, the more valuable this becomes. Remember that hybridization means we can stack either weapon or spell damage, weapon crit or spell crit. Our attacks will scale to whichever stats are highest. So you can have this or minor brutality from a Dragon Knight. The only rule is that you want to stack the minor and major versions of the same buff. So if you've already got major sorcery and major brutality, then either of the minor buffs will work. But if you're only getting one major buff, from potions for example, try to get the minor buff that goes with it. But don't worry, it's not going to kill your damage if these buffs aren't perfect. Luckily on a Templar, we're always going to be casting either Backlash or Solar Flare on cooldown, so this pretty much takes care of itself. Restoring Spirit. Cost reduction across the board. The only comparable passive in the game is the Imperial Red Diamond passive, which is 6%. And we don't have to trigger anything to get resources back, it's just there, and the more abilities you cast per minute, the greater the benefit. Mending. This is like a healing execute, healing for more the lower the target's health. It only affects this skill line, but if we're using Rushed Ceremony as a self-heal in a tight spot, activating Restoring Aura mid-fight, or just when we're standing in our rune focus, this will kick in and make the heals a little stronger when we need it. Sacred Ground. Minor mending while standing in our rune, ritual or healing ult for even more healing. We're going to be using ritual anyway, and this is an extra incentive. Plus, it grants a unique boost to block mitigation, which we're not really thinking about as damage dealers, but now and then, it might just save you. Light Weaver. You don't hear this passive talked about much. DDs are never going to use Rite of Passage or spend much time healing others, and even if a healer keeps extended ritual under the group, you probably shouldn't be dipping below 50% health often enough for this to make much difference. It's a very cool idea, but when you look at its impact in content, it's minimal. Maybe if the threshold were a little higher, or if it also applied to the caster, this would be more useful. Master Ritualist. This doesn't add any power as such, but countless wipes have been averted because of this passive, specifically by smart Templar DDs who spot a dead support and immediately go to res them. Even an extra second can matter, and tanks will always appreciate coming back with more health. It's not part of our damage toolkit, but if you're on a Templar, be especially nimble with the reses. That's it. Definitely not as fancy as the Sorcerer passives, which is the last video I did, but there's some awesome stuff in here for damage, sustain, armor, and healing. And none of it is especially complicated. I always pick 4 key passives on the ninjapools.com DPS guides, and for Templar, it's Burning Light, Illuminate, Piercing Spear, and Prism. So stay on the offensive, keep up Power of the Light until it's time to beam, and slot Aedric Spear abilities on both bars if you can. Then all 4 of these will always be in full effect. Next up, active abilities. As usual, we're not talking about PvP or support, just damage. Aedric Spear, Radial Sweep. We're often going to choose Dawnbreaker over this as a front bar ultimate, more on that later, but don't count Sweep out completely. If you're consistently fighting at least 3 opponents, then Everlasting Sweep might even be better. It's also super cheap, and if for some reason you can't have another Aedric Spear ability on your front bar, you can always slot this for the Piercing Spear passive and that extra critical damage. Puncturing Strikes, our class spammable and an iconic Templar ability. Biting Jabs costs stamina, deals physical damage, and grants you major brutality and sorcery, which can be very handy sometimes. Puncturing Sweep costs magicka, deals magic damage, and heals you for quite a lot, which is also incredibly useful. Both morphs are melee and have decent splash damage. Just remember that it is a single target ability with an AoE component, not a pure AoE ability. Only the closest enemy takes the full damage, so try to make sure that's the boss. Some people really don't like the channel, but the trick is to ignore the animation and weave it as you would anything else. One unfortunate detail is that we tend to slot the Deadly Aim and Thaumaturge champion points to buff our Execute Beam, our most powerful ability. But that means having CPs which don't buff our spammable at all, which does drop the damage slightly. Also, Biting Jabs does spend some of its power budget on that brutality and sorcery, which we often have already. Then again, Stamplars can also use other weapon spammables if they want to, while Magplars tend to stick with Sweep. Piercing Javelin. Fun to use, but ultimately not that useful in PvE unless you want to use Aurora Javelin to knock small adds off ledges in places like Tempest Island, Frost Vault, or Oathsworn Pit, which I can highly recommend by the way, since it's a lot of fun. Focused Charge. Again, not for DDs. Explosive Charge is an AoE interrupt, which can be handy if the fight is crowded or there are multiple infusers that need to be interrupted, but the damage is weak, it's expensive, and more importantly, as of update 44, both morphs also taunt, which we definitely want to avoid, except maybe in solo content where it doesn't matter. In that case, you could use Explosive Charge for the stun, Toppling Charge for off balance. Both morphs also give you major protection for 7 seconds. Spear Shards. A weird skill that deals more than half of its damage up front. The dot lasts 10 seconds but isn't all that strong. Still, the overall damage per cast is great, and the big upfront hit means we can use this as a kind of spammable in trash balls or multi-target boss fights, so long as you can sustain it. Either way, we want the Blazing Spear morph for more damage, and we'll include it in our rotation if we have the space. This is another one of those we can slot for the Piercing Spear passive if we're not using strikes as a spammable. Sun Shield. This scales to our max health and is therefore less effective on a damage dealer. But we can still get an 8k shield out of it, and more if we're surrounded by adds in solo content. Radiant Ward deals damage when you cast it and can make the shield much bigger. Even with 3 enemies within 5 meters, you're talking a 13k shield. Blazing Shield deals damage when it ends, so you can use it as a pre-buff between waves, but the shield is smaller. Both morphs also apply minor maim to nearby enemies, which might be handy sometimes, but is not something we're going to reach for that often. Dawn's Wrath. Nova, an underrated ultimate, and one of the few sources of AoE major maim, reducing enemy damage. In Dungeon Trash, many tanks already apply this debuff with Void Bash, but Nova can still be used just for damage. We'll want Solar Prison for the most damage, especially from the synergy. If you've got someone taking that synergy every time, this can be worth using. But it is quite expensive, so unless you need the maim, many DDs will go for Shooting Star instead for the lower cost, extra damage and burning, and the faster ultigen when it hits multiple targets. Sunfire, a super long sticky dot and a nice source of flame damage. It also grants Major Savagery and Prophecy, making Templar one of the few classes that can get all 4 of the basic damage buffs from within its own toolkit. We'll want the Vampire's Bane morph most of the time for single target damage. The damage per cast is really high, and it makes it a lot easier for Templars to run tri-stat potions without having to sacrifice front bar space. Solar Flare. Dark Flare is for use against players, so we want Solar Barrage. Partly for the AoE damage, but mostly for the buff to all our class abilities. That can affect as much as 60% of our damage, and means that if your rotation is on point, Barrage can be worth over 200k per cast. That's crazy. So unless you drop a whole bunch of Templar abilities, definitely keep this in your rotation and don't let it run out, especially in Execute. Backlash. This is probably our core ability, like Blast Bones for Necromancers, Daedric Prey for Sorcerers. We generally want Power of the Light for the Sundered uptime, but Purifying Light is excellent too if you're struggling with stamina sustain. Either way, this is the main thing we want to recast on cooldown and without fail. Because it hits so hard and we can't spam it, we have to wait 6 seconds for it to explode, then immediately recast it. The damage from the explosion scales to our DPS effectively, again rewarding us for staying on the offensive. It also triggers that Prism Ultigen passive perfectly on cooldown, helping us stay ahead of other classes with our Ultigen. Staying on top of this ability is one of the 2 crucial steps to get the most out of your Templar, so break your rotation into sections of 6 seconds each and always keep this rolling. Eclipse. A great utility for PvP, and Living Dark could be used in solo dungeons or duo content to snare enemies, but bar space is limited and generally this is not going to be high up on our list. Radiant Destruction. This is the other crucial step in dealing great damage with a Templar, setting up our Execute. Stamina Templars might need to use Radiant Glory for Magicka Sustain, but Radiant Oppression is the stronger morph and that's the one we want, if possible. Above 50%, it's pretty rubbish and we don't even use it. But once the target hits 50%, it ranks up aggressively in damage, overtaking our spammable at about 40% and gradually leaving everything in the dust in terms of damage per cast. So we progressively drop stuff from our rotation and focus more and more on the beam. Ideally, we want all of our dots rolling right until the end of the fight, and for short executes, that's easy enough. But for longer executes, we will have to be smart about our recasts. For example, Vampire's Bane for Savagery and Prophecy, Solar Barrage for that 5% boost, our backbar weapon dot. If you can refresh all that stuff so it just about lasts until the end of the fight, great. But if they drop off below 15%, that's a damage loss, but it's probably not worth recasting them either. Of course, these thresholds aren't set in stone. That's what target dummies are for, to get a feel for that combat loop until it's comfortable, consistent, and deals as much damage as possible. There is a knack to using Radiant Destruction, but it sends our damage absolutely skyrocketing, so it's worth learning to do properly. Restoring Light. Rite of Passage. Healing Ultimate can be very strong, but nothing of interest to us. Rushed Ceremony. A burst heal which scales to our offensive stats rather than max health. This makes it very strong on a damage dealer, and if we're facing a particularly nasty healing check in a dungeon or solo content, this basically lets us cheat death for a while. It is expensive though. Honor the Dead heals you or an ally, and becomes way cheaper if the target is under 75% health. Breath of Life also heals a second target for a smaller amount. Healing Ritual, an AoE burst heal with minor expedition on the Hasty Morph. We're very unlikely to use this. Restoring Aura, fantastic for sustain if you need it. Templar supports typically use Radiant Aura to buff sustain for the entire group because it lasts an entire minute. We can just slot it passively to get the same buffs permanently, or use Repentance to get heals and stamina back from corpses, after trash pulls for example. This can be very strong anywhere where enemies are dying regularly. Cleansing Ritual. We want Ritual of Retribution, since that deals damage in a very large area. The damage per cast is excellent even against a single target, and if a lot of enemies are standing in it, then it's just amazing. The other morph heals you, and can also be very good in the right situation. Rune Focus. Every class has a unique source of major resolve, an important armor buff that we should always have, unless we're doing very easy content. If you're not getting major resolve from a warden with Frostcloak, you must know how to get it yourself. This one doubles as a sustain tool and a soft heal over time, which gets stronger if we stand in the rune. Channeled Focus restores magicka and lasts longer, while Restoring Focus restores stamina and heals for more. Ideally, we want to get armor and sustain from our supports, but this will help a lot if you're solo or if you're just not quite getting what you need. That's it! The Templar toolkit skews heavily towards damage and healing, and we have plenty of things to play with here to make us much more effective across a range of different encounters. But the basic components of our rotation are pretty much dictated by the way these abilities work, the amount of damage we gain by leaning into them, and how much we lose by failing to play the class properly. The abilities we really can't afford to say no to are Radiant Oppression, Backlash, and Ritual. And it therefore follows that we should grab Solar Barrage to buff all of those abilities. We're also likely to want Vampire's Bane for that massive single target damage per cast, even if we already have Major Prophecy and Savagery. And our class spammable, Puncturing Sweep for magicka, Biting Jabs for stamina. And if we still have room, Blazing Spear. That doesn't leave us a ton of space. As usual, for the back bar we can choose between a Maelstrom two-handed with Stampede, a Maelstrom Inferno with Blockade, or the Maelstrom or Master's Bow. Stamina Templars will probably want to keep Spear. If we're using Tri-Stat potions, we'll need a Sync for all that extra magicka sustain pre-execute. That also keeps Piercing Spear active if we take another spammable like Lethal Arrow, which is a popular move. And if we do that, we may need Degeneration for Brutality and Sorcery if there's no Dragon Knight with Igneous Weapons in our group. Magicka Templars, on the other hand, might not be able to sustain Spear, so you can swap that for Deadly Cloak or just Inner Light, Camouflaged Hunter, or whatever you need. If you're using a 2H and the fight is long enough, grab Carve. Then the usual Barbed Trap, Shooting Star, and Dawnbreaker. You can use Everlasting Sweep against multiple enemies as we discussed, but in my experience it's best to use Shooting Star pre-execute, which is slightly stronger, and just have Dawnbreaker there for the stat boost on the front bar. Then once we start beaming, it flips. The extra damage stats we get from casting Dawnbreaker will actually buff Radiant Oppression even higher, so it becomes advantageous to use Dawnbreaker in execute instead. You don't have to do all of that stuff, but currently that's how it stacks up. If you need heals or other utilities, you can drop things like Carve, Deadly Cloak, or Blazing Spear, possibly Ritual if fights are very mobile, Bane if you need Cleave and don't need the buffs, or even Barrage if you're ditching class abilities and that 5% boost isn't going to be worth as much. And then slot things like Rune Focus, Vigor, Caltrops, Scribed abilities, or whatever you need. Trying to approach everything in ESO with just one build is just not a good idea. Anyone who's played the game over the long term knows that we should adapt to different encounters. Sometimes with big changes, sometimes just minor tweaks. But if you want a starting point, these are the setups I currently have saved as defaults for my Magicka Templar and my Stamina Templar for bosses and trash. Obviously, check things like penetration and critical damage buffs, and slot things like Backstabber or Force of Nature if you're falling short, but these should be a good place to start. Important point, if you can't sustain, do try using tri-stat potions. Templar can benefit enormously from using these, especially Stamina Templar, which can really struggle without them. For more explanations on gear, CPs, and consumables, we've got all 14 damage classes on ninjapulse.com, where you'll find all of this info broken down and easy to digest. And you're very welcome to join the guild Discord if you've got additional questions, a specific type of build you want to try, or if you just want to shoot the breeze with some other Templar enjoyers, some of them super experienced. And with that, I think we've covered it. Templar isn't super complicated, but it is very engaging to play, and has enough moving parts to really satisfy a methodical player who takes the time to perfect that rhythm and that execute. Hopefully I've helped you a bit with this video, and this summary will encourage you to experiment and improve with this class. Specific rotation videos are coming soon, and I'll illustrate step by step how to easily break 100k, 120k, and beyond. Remember to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything, and so YouTube knows that you guys actually like what we're doing here. If you want to do more to support Ninja Pulse, you can become a YouTube member for exclusive video content every month, hang out with us on Twitch, or just like, sub, and share the video with other players. That's totally free and really helps us grow. I get so many questions from players who could really benefit from a guide like this, and there must be thousands of them out there who don't even know this channel is there for them. So please, if you're in guilds or discords with these people, send them here to us. Thanks a lot, you guys are the best. Check the description for my other recent videos, the website, Twitch, and the Discord, where you can message me, Khan, and the other officers for tips and advice anytime. Look after yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.